Well, I took a roundabout way to what I ended up doing. I was a student of literature in my university days, and then rather accidentally afterward I began studying Homeric Greek. I loved it. I loved the classical languages. And a professor took me aside and said, "You ought to do archaeology," which had been an interest of mine since I was a child. So I said, all right, I'll go to grad school, I'll study classics, and I'll sign up for a couple of digs in Sicily over the summer. I flew to Sicily, I did the digs, I loved archaeology, but I loved Italy even more. And so I decided against my professor's wishes that I would not be going back to grad school, and that I jumped ship and landed in Italy. With nothing to do, really. I taught English for a while. I went to Rome, and I arrived in Rome the day after the Red Brigade's terrorists had kidnapped Aldo Moro, who was about to be prime minister. And it was a big news story. I mean, the biggest ever in Italy. And I decided, well, I think I'll walk down to the English language newspaper and see if they're hiring. And they said, sit down and write a headline. And I became a journalist that day. So I worked at the Rome Daily American, which, by the way, was the newspaper of Roman holiday. And I was living the life of Roman holiday. We were paid very little, but Italy was cheap in those days. And one of the stories I covered was this weird thing that happened over at the Vatican. They had a pope who died after 33 days in office. And everybody in Rome assumed he was murdered or something. And I thought, wow, that's a really strange place, the Vatican. And I remember riding my bicycle over to St. Peter's Square. It was October of 1978. And the word had gone around Rome, white smoke, fumata bianca, which meant they had elected a pope. And so I was able to actually ride my bike into St. Peter's Square, right under the balcony window where they announced his name. And they said, Wojtyła. And the way they pronounced it, it made people think he was an African. Nobody recognized his name. This was the Polish Cardinal, Karol Wojtyła. And when he came out and addressed the crowd, the Italians among us, and they were all Italians really, were very uneasy. This was the first non-Italian pope in 455 years, and they were not that happy about it. But Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, spoke their language. He spoke in Italian. In fact, he told them, if I make a mistake, please correct me. Now let's all go home and have a nice dinner. And right away they said, okay, he's one of us, he's good. And the Italians learned to love him. But that was really my introduction to the Vatican. I never dreamed, standing there in the square that evening, that I would return in 2 or 3 years as a journalist assigned to cover the Vatican day in, day out. Because that's what happened. In 1982, I was working for ABC News and the Associated Press in Rome, and I got a job offer from Catholic News Service. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I have been a Catholic all my life, not a great Catholic, but I thought I know something about the church. I wonder what it would be like to work for a Catholic news agency. So I interviewed, and it looked pretty appealing. And the reason was that I literally would be covering the Vatican as a beat. Now, I had worked for Associated Press, and I knew that, a large part of that job is rewriting the Italian wire service. You sit at a desk most of the day. It wasn't all that exciting. ABC News was exciting, but a lot of the stories we worked on never made the air. So, not as satisfying. And so I took the job with Catholic News Service. And I walked into the Vatican press office on my first day with my brand new tape recorder, and I thought, here I am. and I looked around, and there were about 15 or 20 other reporters. They were the veterans. It was a very kind of close-knit tribal group of journalists who covered the Vatican, and that's what they would do their whole lives. And I did it for more than 30 years. And my first day was a little bit odd because after I set down my tape recorder on a table, I came back 5 minutes later and it was gone, and I never found it again. So I wondered a little about this environment at the Vatican, but I had a lot to learn. It was a steep learning curve even for a lifelong Catholic. I thought you could simply walk up to cardinals with a tape recorder and start asking them questions. I soon found out that you could not do that. I now write books. I no longer work as a journalist because after 32 years I retired. And when I retired, I wrote a book called The Vatican Diaries. I had saved up enough great stories that never made it into news articles. And I said, I gotta write about how things really happen backstage at the Vatican. And as luck would have it, or Providence would have it, the book came out the week that Pope Benedict announced his resignation. And anybody who was looking for the latest book on the Vatican grabbed it. It became a New York Times bestseller, I think largely due to timing, and I was very, very fortunate. And my second book, I decided to branch out and do something a little different, but something still about Catholic life in the Vatican. I wrote about the Vatican and the supernatural, how the Vatican tries to evaluate things like miracles, apparitions, divine prophecies, those odd events that don't seem to fit into our modern state of mind, the modern idea that faith coexists with reason. I know these things present a problem to the Vatican, and so I wanted to go behind the scenes once again and talk about how Vatican experts try to evaluate, judge, and weed out the true from the false. And so now I write books. Having covered the Vatican for 30-some years, I am a certified expert, and it's wonderful because I actually did learn how the Vatican works.
Well, I gotta follow up that one with how does it work?
The most surprising thing that I learned almost from day one covering the Vatican was that there is very little coordination between Vatican offices and Vatican officials, between the cardinals of the Church and, say, the Pope. You would think that in what is arguably the world's most hierarchical organization, that there would be a kind of top-down chain of command, pretty rigorous chain of command. But in actual fact, things don't happen that way. You will find bit players at the Vatican who have an amazing degree of autonomy and who often create the most interesting news stories. People speak out of turn. Reporters talk about Vatican secrecy. It's largely a myth. The Vatican is not some hermetically sealed kind of environment. I often found that by making phone calls blind to people I didn't even know, I could get them to talk. You speak their language, you establish who you are. If they know you're a serious person, they'll always talk to you. And this idea of Vatican secrecy is way overblown. You sometimes have to take cardinals to lunch, but that's a price you pay. I discovered that under the pontificates of John Paul II, especially in the later years, and especially under Pope Benedict, that what the Pope's underlings were doing often undermined what the Pope himself wanted to do. Now, this was very clear, for example, when Pope Benedict discovered that his own butler, the man who was supposed to be laying out his clothes and serving him soup, was in his spare time photocopying confidential papal documents and handing them off to an Italian reporter. This was a real betrayal, and the odd thing about that was that the Pope's butler was doing this in the office of the Pope's secretaries, so that he was using the office photocopier to make copies of these documents, hundreds and hundreds of pages. You would have thought someone might have questioned him, but they never did. Things went missing. Donation checks, for example, to Pope Benedict, totaling more than $100,000, went missing once, and nobody ever missed it. There were many other decisions that were made that blindsided Pope Benedict and others, and I really do think that that's one reason why the Pope decided in the end to resign. He was not being well served by the people beneath him. Now, as a journalist, of course, I didn't want to complain about this too much, because a leaky ship is good for a journalist. People who talk is a great thing. Otherwise, how do you get information? If I were running the Vatican's PR operation, I would tighten things up dramatically, but I'm not, and I don't want to. So for me, the fact that lower level people feel they have the freedom to talk is a good thing. For the popes, sometimes it's not so good. That was the most surprising thing that I discovered about how the Vatican works.
I'm also curious about kind of how you worked with the Vatican. I mean, your initial story is of a tremendous piece of luck.
Right.
And it sounds as if luck figures at various points in this story, that when your book came out, and stuff like that. On the other hand, I can't believe you weren't doing something right. I'm curious,
Right.
What did it take from you to do the Vatican beat?
Well, when I took my job with Catholic News Service, most of my friends back in Minnesota assumed I was working for the Vatican. And when we would come back for vacation, they would say, "So, you work for the Vatican now?" And I would always say, "No, I work for a news agency that covers the Vatican." And for us, the distinction was critical. We were journalists, professional journalists, hired to do a job. We were specialists in religious news. But when it came to the Vatican always knew that we were on the other side of the line in terms of the idea that we would ask tough questions. We would report the good news and the bad news. And believe me, I saw a lot of bad news over the years at the Vatican. Not only the sex abuse scandals, but financial scandals, things the Vatican did not want to shine a light on, and that we did. And in the end, I think that's what gets their respect. The Vatican actually has a pretty tough skin when it comes to criticism. They never overreact to journalists. And I think they recognize the fact that journalists, wherever they're coming from, are expected to ask hard questions and to not always be satisfied with the answers they get. And so really, that's all I did. I didn't try to be the Pope's best friend. I didn't try to be the Cardinal's best friend. In fact, I remember my very first assignment was to interview a cardinal who was named Joseph Ratzinger, who later became, of course, Pope Benedict. And I thought, well, he's giving a speech at a pontifical university. I think I'll just wait outside the door, and then when he steps out, I'll put my tape recorder in his face and ask my question. And I did that. He finished his speech. He left the podium and walked out the door. And when I put my tape recorder up, his assistant, Don Clemens, who was a fairly big guy, cross-body blocked me with a really good block, and I never got close. And I was left more or less flat up against the wall. And I had to learn that that's not the way you interview cardinals. You You make, in those days, a written request, and then you wait for a written response. And you hope the answer is yes. And you may have to be very patient and wait days or weeks. So, I tried to be aggressive, but in the end you learn that there are the ways of the Vatican that you need to follow. But at the same time, if you're a journalist covering the Vatican, you do have to be, in a sense, an enemy. And what we journalists would always do is remind the cardinals and the other officials that, as Pope John Paul II once said, the church should be a glass house. And that was a papal quote that Vatican officials never really liked to hear. So I guess what I did right was simply I honed my journalistic skills. They were not great at the beginning. I had to learn a lot. But in the end, I think that's what saved me. That's what got respect, even among Vatican officials. I can remember also one time, one of the most surprising moments of my journalistic career at the Vatican was in the year 2002, I believe it was. John Paul II, who had a penchant for doing things a little bit differently, every year around Easter, on Good Friday, in fact, he led a procession at the Rome Colosseum. And it was to remember the martyrs of the early Christian days doing the Stations of the Cross. So this Via Crucis was very important. And every year, he would either read some meditations that he had written or that another eminent theologian had written, or a cardinal had written. Well, this particular year, the Pope decided he was going to ask journalists to write the meditations for each Station of the Cross. And I got a phone call from the Pope's press secretary who said, the Pope would like you to write a meditation. Would you do this? And I said, oh, absolutely, of course. He said, good. He wants you to write it for the first station, the agony in the garden. And I said, that's fine. And I hung up the phone and immediately started sweating and having my own little agony, because I thought, what on earth am I ever going to tell the Pope? What do I have to say about this? What could he possibly be interested in my ideas about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? And I did my best, like the other journalists. Some made it a little contemporary, some went off on a poetic bent. I tried to get inside the mind of Jesus, who was having doubts, and I wrote what I thought made sense. But I was very much afraid, because I thought they are going to read these things on live international television in front of John Paul II, who is going to be sitting there listening to them. And what if the Pope hears this very first meditation on Jesus in the garden, struggles to his feet and says, it is not so? I mean, I imagined all kinds of reactions. Of course, the Pope didn't do that. He was very gracious. In fact, he thanked us each. He thought it was wonderful. He got us to think. Again, I was amazed that he would have the confidence to do this, to turn a major papal liturgy, in effect, over to journalists. And I learned later that many of his aides were against this idea, but he actually pressed for it.
So, well, just a small question. Were you running this all in Italian? Was your intercourse with these folks in Italian?
Italian was the lingua franca at the Vatican, yes. I had to learn Italian. I had learned Italian when I first went to Italy, although it took me a long time. It took me a couple of years of reading newspapers, listening to radio, watching TV, and making a lot of Italian friends before I really felt comfortable speaking Italian. And so when I began reporting at the Vatican, I knew Italian fairly well. But then I had to learn Vatican speak, which is its own language, of course. I mean, first of all, how to address people. You don't call the Pope Mr. Pope. You don't call him Sir. You call him, as President George Bush once did, you call him Your Holiness. You call a cardinal Your Eminence. You call a bishop Your Excellency. And it's pretty simple once you learn it. But there's a whole other set of terminology that you better know too. You need to know what an archdiocese is and what a diocese is, what an apostolic vicar is, what missionary territories are, and what distinguishes them from regular dioceses. And then you had to figure out, of course, the labyrinthian Vatican bureaucracy. Who controls what these offices are. And many of them seem to overlap. And probably, in an efficient bureaucracy would be eliminated, which is one thing Pope Francis is trying to do. But when I was starting out at the Vatican, there were 3 or 4 or 5 offices that dealt with money, for example. And figuring out what they did was not easy, even for those who worked inside the Vatican. So the language definitely was Italian. I, at the same time, of course, had studied Latin. And I half expected, prelates to be walking along the Vatican corridors speaking Latin. There were very few of those left by the time I ended up covering the Vatican.
Well, I'm just remembering some of the most painful things that came out, even to somebody like me who avoids the Catholic spirit for moral reasons. One thing that was coming out was some pretty serious sexual coercion stuff with very high people in this hierarchy, which strikes me, it's Melrose Place kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's as bad as it gets for a group of people who see each other every day and eat in each other's houses and so forth.
Right.
It's hard for me to imagine that amity could be maintained with the press when that kind of thing comes out. I mean, there are scandals. There are things one wants cleared up oneself, and one may not be able to speak, but one wants them straightened out. One wants light shined. It's hard for me to believe somehow. I just want to query that.
Yep.
That amity could be maintained when it was a matter of the disgrace of the guy I see every month. I see every month at the supper table.
Right. In fact, the sexual abuse scandals really were all over the map. We know that there were many of them in the dioceses of the United States and in other countries that came to light primarily in 2002 in the Archdiocese of Boston. There were other smaller scale scandals that were going on right in the Pope's backyard, involving Vatican officials, involving cardinals. There was a cardinal in Austria who, for example, it came out, he was supposedly a very pious man. Pope John Paul II appointed him to head the Vienna Archdiocese, and then it came out that he had conducted himself very improperly with certain seminarians. And poor John Paul II, I'm sure the scales fell from his eyes at one point, and he removed him. But it was very tough for him to do that. He did not want to believe the worst about priests in general and cardinals he had named. And this was, I think, the common attitude at the Vatican as the sex abuse stories were breaking around the world. I can remember a Vatican cardinal coming into a major press conference in 2002. It was like 9 o'clock at night, a very odd hour for the Vatican. They had been meeting all day with U.S. bishops to devise a response to the sex abuse cases. And this cardinal, Castrillon Hoyos, was very much opposed to any concessions being made, to any changes in church law that would make it easier to defrock priests. He thought that the sex abuse scandal was largely a result of media exaggerations, and he said so at this press conference. I would say that Vatican relations with the press had never hit such a low level. There was disgust on both sides. However, from that moment on, things changed. And John Paul II, of course, was sick and fairly feeble in his last years. He did not aggressively pursue sex abuse offenders, but he did change the law. He changed the church law, largely at the request of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who at the time headed the doctrinal congregation. Cardinal Ratzinger had the files on sex abuse offenders, and he was very upset with what he saw, and he said, we need to prosecute these people more diligently. He got John Paul II to change the law, and then when he became Pope Benedict, he made it even easier to defrock priests. So, yes, there was a learning curve on the Vatican side as well, and a wholesale change of attitude. I was amazed that by the time Pope Benedict went to the United States in, I think, the 4th or 5th year of his pontificate, maybe it was the 3rd year, he stood in front of reporters and took very aggressive questions on sex abuse and answered them extremely eloquently. And he made it clear, the press is not our enemy, the truth is not our enemy. We have to do our best to be vigilant, we have to do better, we have to reach out to victims. The whole thing had been flipped in a sense. And anybody who was not on board was quietly retired. I think under Pope Francis, it's gone even farther. This Pope has set up a commission of clergy and lay experts who advise him on sex abuse. And he is now setting up a tribunal that will look into the way bishops have dealt with sex abuse cases. So we're getting at the issue of not only priests who have abused children or others, but at the bishops and the way they handled those priests, the way they dealt with those priests. And once again, Pope Francis has been very clear. The press is not our enemy. So I think, in a sense, the Vatican has learned its lesson on this, that when you attack the press, it's almost always counterproductive, but especially in this case, when any reporter could simply point to facts on the ground.
I'm trying to tell myself a story about this, and it isn't working. Mm-hmm. The story is that this institution adopted celibacy, 300? Someplace like that. Mm-hmm. And then there was a period of 1,600 years, right? Very, of massive increase of power and all the power relations happening. And during that time, one of two things happened. Either there wasn't a whole lot of sexual abuse of young people, sexual abuse of vulnerable folks or underlings, or more likely there was quite a lot of it. In the first case, it's a sort of 20th century, late 19th century phenomenon, and now we're responding properly. In the second case, it just wasn't noticed until these mouthy people in the 20th century began, not being so respectful about their clergy. And neither of these stories makes any sense to me. And the story that seems to me likely right is that people have known for 1,600 years that there's some extremely disturbing and probably in every imaginable sense evil people in high office
Right.
here. And that a whole lot of this stuff has been going on. But I mean, how do you read this? I mean, how do you read it? I mean, it erupts and now we say, well, we're going to be honest about it, but as if somebody as smart as John Paul II wouldn't have had a pretty good percentage in his head of how many people in Poland were being abused.
That's a good point. I think John Paul II had a blind spot when it came to this. He did look for the good in people. He did not look for the evil. I think that was especially true when it came to the priesthood. And I think he felt that there was some grace that saved priests somehow from these kind of weaknesses. I think priestly celibacy, there's a big debate, of course. Does celibacy skew the field in some way? Does it attract people who have problems on a sexual level, as well as people who are, of course, firmly committed to the ideal of celibacy? I think it's an open question. The research still needs to be done. I do think that what we're seeing, though, is that church leaders under Pope Francis in particular are more open to changing the celibacy rule. And I think we're going to see that in coming years. I mean, the fact is the Catholic Church has married priests at the moment, as we know, in the Eastern rites and in those Anglican priests who have come over and brought their wives and families into the Catholic Church. So,
in South Dakota.
Yes, in South Dakota or wherever they may be. Their biggest problem probably is not supporting a family, but living in South Dakota. Who knows? So there's not a doctrinal issue here. It's a traditional issue, a disciplinary issue. It's sometimes called, and I think it's definitely time for a new look. I suspect Pope Francis will change this by quietly introducing geographical areas where married priests may be admitted on an experimental basis, and then, you would enlarge that if needed, if it works well. As to the relationship between celibacy and sexual abuse is, as I say, an open question. I do think that it's not simply a modern phenomenon. I think that probably for, centuries and centuries, this kind of abuse went on. I caught a glimpse of it once when I covered a very odd story. It was actually a book that was written by a Vatican official who had access to the very secret records at the Apostolic Penitentiary. Now, the Apostolic Penitentiary sounds like a prison, but it's actually an office that would grant papal indulgence or forgiveness for grave sins. And of course, they have records going back centuries of the gravest of sins. And among these were written records of petitions made by priests, nuns, bishops, abbots for grave sins they had committed. And some of the gravest were sexual in nature. Now, this particular researcher, who was a priest, wrote a book in which I believe the title was called Saints and Sinners, but it was more sinners than saints, believe me. And he used this material. And the book, for about a week, was like the biggest bestseller in Rome. It flew off the shelves, and then the Vatican suddenly clamped down. It ordered him and the publisher to withdraw all the copies of the book, and it eventually drummed him out of the Vatican and sent him home. And he died a broken man. They said, you never should have written this book. Even though these cases are hundreds of years old, you broke the seal of confessional, and we can't be airing our dirty laundry like this. Nevertheless, it was eye-opening, and it led me to believe that, yes, sexual abuse and a whole lot of other terrible things were going on even in parishes of the Middle Ages, or in churches, or in monasteries, or in convents.
And just to tie it up, I mean, John Paul II, who's now a saint, may have had a rather rosy view of priests, but it's close to unimaginable that his predecessors did. I mean, taking the list back to, say, 1800.
Right.
So there must have been popes who were aware that altar boys were being sodomized.
Right.
In quantity, in their dominions, who, I mean, did nothing about it.
It's hard for me to imagine how far up the information chain this news passed. It may be that these cases were kept quiet at the local level. It may be that this kind of, mafioso omertà, this code of silence, was so strong that you did not ever pass this kind of information up. I mean, theoretically, the Pope has eyes and ears in every country, and in every diocese. He's got his bishop there. But I can imagine bishops saying this news should never reach Rome, in part because it would protect the church, and in part because it would make him look bad. So it's tough to pass judgment on popes when we don't know what they knew. This really is, I think, a modern phenomenon under John Paul II. He was given at least some information.
Yes. I mean, the thing that still makes me uneasy is that, I mean, nobody starts out as pope. They start out as a parish priest who hangs around with a lot of other parish priests, and then they distinguish themselves in various ways and climb various ladders. And along the way, you meet a lot of people, see a lot of stuff, hear a lot of rumors.
It's true.
It really comes down to a question for those popes, say 1800 on, just to choose a name. Just how bright were they? I mean, how bright and observant were they on this path that led them at 70 or 60 or 80 or whatever to that particular chair?
Yeah, it's tough to imagine that popes and others were unaware of all that was going on. On the other hand, I look at my own experience. I went to a university where several monks and priests were later found to be sexual abusers. And I spent 4 or 5 years there, and I had no clue. I had no idea. So, again, passing judgment on those folks is much tougher. I often wonder, for example, did even John Paul II know about Father Maciel, who was the founder of the Legionaries of Christ? John Paul II thought Maciel was just the cat's pajamas. I mean, he loved him. He would appear on stage with him. He called him just a wonderful pastor. And he loved him because Maciel ran arguably the church's most successful religious order after the Second Vatican Council. This was a religious order that was gaining new priests every day, that was pulling in millions and millions of dollars, that was expanding, that was building, that was pulling in seminarians from all over the world. And, of course, the Polish Pope wanted to encourage that. At a certain point, news surfaced that Father Maciel had been sodomizing his own seminarians. Then it came out that he had a double and then a triple identity. He was married to 2 different women in Mexico. And, I mean, it seems outrageous. First of all, the people in Rome weren't aware. I'm sure his legionary superiors, some of them, were aware. The question is, was this information passed on to John Paul II? Because at that point, John Paul II was suffering a lot from Parkinson's disease, and his gatekeeper was really his secretary, Cardinal Stanislaw Dziwisz, who was a great friend of Father Maciel and of the Legionaries of Christ. And so the people who complained, including some of his victims who wrote out accusations and mailed them to the Pope, even they aren't quite sure whether it got past Cardinal Dziwisz and the Pope ever saw what they had written. So again, popes are protected in many ways. Many times they're protected from bad news. And I think this was probably one of those cases.
I guess I know what I know about news partly from TV dramas about news. Most recently from Newsroom, which I think is about as powerful a thing as American television has ever produced.
Mm.
And so, but watching that sort of thing, one gets this picture of folks with a fairly interesting epistemology mixed with a fairly interesting ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of stuff you know is happening that you can't print as happening because the sources aren't lining up right.
Right.
That's the story, with regard to American political scandals. You can kind of tell the story of what it took before something could be printed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how that plays out where you've got this leaky ship.
Right.
But one of the features of a leaky ship is that there are a lot of people who want to be taken to know more than they possibly could know.
That's very true.
And if there are 5 different sources and places that are handling money, and they all have 5 different takes on how the money's being handled,
right?
Are there particular worries in this nest of issues that are partly epistemological and partly ethical?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being a journalist at the Vatican, you always have to be careful of false steps, false leads, of people playing you and manipulating you. And, that goes with the territory. I have found in particular at the Vatican that journalists were often used as a conduit of information. For example, I would have an interview with somebody who, let's say, was in charge of a Vatican financial office. And I would ask my questions, he would answer them, and then at the end of the interview, he would ask me some questions. And some of the questions were, what do you hear about what this other office is doing? Oh, have you heard this? And it became clear that I was part of the information grapevine. I wasn't just there to ask questions. He was trying to suss me out a little bit, see what I knew, and gain information. Part of a journalist's job, I've always thought, is in a way is to be a con man. I mean, you want to get people to trust you. And it's not that you're not sincere, but the very first step is to get somebody to trust you. And to do that at the Vatican, you have to suggest in some way that for them to tell you this is going to serve their interests in the long run. And this does present ethical dilemmas because sometimes you know that it's not going to serve their interests. Sometimes you know that if this guy tells me something, he could get fired or reprimanded. I remember once I caught wind of a Vatican document well before it was issued. And this particular document was very, very sensitive. It was in the drafting stages. This was a document in which the Vatican was saying, if you are a gay man, we don't want you to be a priest. In fact, you cannot be a priest. Now, this was an earthquake. I mean, this was big news. And when I first heard the rumor, I said, I've got to check this out. So I called 3 people. And the first call went pretty well. He said, oh yeah, we're working on it. I said, really? What does it say? And he told me what it said. Now our condition was I would not use his name. I called a second source. He didn't want to talk about it so much, but then of course I told him, I let on that I already knew a lot about it, and I said, look, if there's something here that I should know from you, tell me now, because I'm going to run a story. Well, then he started spilling his guts. And so yes, you wheedle, you do whatever you can to get the information if you're a journalist. In a sense, you feel a little bit guilty afterward, but I feel that, as most journalists do, my first job is to get the information. I would never run with a story just on 1 or 2 sources, so I checked it out with a third source, and then I ran a big story. And 2 days later, a Vatican cardinal stood up and denounced my story as complete fabrication and said there is no such document. And 3 years later, the Vatican issued the document, which said no gay men can become priests. So, my story was correct, but it was at that stage deniable, and nobody really knew in the end until it was issued whether it was real or not.
So at least some of the time, the people you're talking to are saying what they say on the condition that they not be named.
Right.
But presumably somebody can figure out for all sorts of sources who actually said things.
As a journalist, you have to be very careful in how you identify your sources at the Vatican. And over the years, I've learned to be more and more particular about any agreements I make with the source. Because I once said, I won't use your name, and he said, okay. But I identified him as a source with deep knowledge of the entire process. And there were only 2 people who had deep knowledge of that process. So he called me up and he said, hey, they know who I am. And I said, well, sorry, I should have been more careful. So now I always would try to say, okay, here's how I'll identify you. And sometimes they say, you can't say you learned this from anybody, which means you just throw it out there. As a journalist, you don't like to do that because you always like to indicate that you have good sourcing on stories, but sometimes you have to.
You were there, 30 years?
Yes.
Now, did you manage to get through 30 years without making any friends at all? I imagine one does make friends, but...
You mean among Vatican officials?
Yeah, but, among anybody who eventually you could write about.
Yeah.
How does that work? To be, embedded in a place, to have it, to be, to have the place as one's social possibility, so to speak, to be dealing with highly intelligent and, the most civilized people on earth.
Right.
Often chosen partly for goodness.
Right.
I imagine some good ones.
There are some good ones.
So how is it to be a journalist in that situation?
Well, journalists approach this very differently. There are many journalists at the Vatican, especially among the Italians, who basically pick their favorites. They choose allegiances. They become practically protégés of certain cardinals. And the cardinals know they can count on them, and they can count on the cardinals. Now, the danger in that, of course, is that you can be bought and sold in some instances as a journalist, and your allegiances will buy you certain types of information, but not others. Coming from the Anglo-Saxon world of journalism, of course, I wanted to maintain the distance between myself and anybody at the Vatican who might be a news source or a news story. And so I didn't want to become best friends with these people. Nevertheless, over time, some of them did become good friends. And they were the ones you would turn to at times when you weren't writing about them or their department. And you would go to them and say, look, am I off base here, or does this strike you as scandalous? Am I off base here, or is somebody's appointment really not a promotion, but a kind of, parking him in a side spot? Things like that, where you need some help interpreting things. And I probably had, 15 or 20 people I could talk to like that by the time I left the Vatican. But I have to say that most of the people I dealt with, I tried to deal with as professionally as possible, and not be such good friends that I was afraid to write something bad about them if necessary.
Has it gotten somewhat easier now that you've moved to books? I mean, because there are things to embarrass people about with supernatural events and how the Vatican handles it, or with the question of the Vatican artworks and what should be done with them. It isn't quite the same, is it?
Right.
One can. I mean, is it true that you can be more sort of partner with the people you're talking to and getting a story out?
I have found it easier writing the books, probably because, like most people, the cardinals of the Roman Curia are deathly afraid of seeing their name in tomorrow's headline. They're a little less concerned if you're writing a book, that might come out in a year or two. And I think that's primarily the reason why they're willing to talk. And probably the other reason is that, having covered the Vatican as a journalist for 30 years, and I kind of hung up my journalistic pen and put on my book writing pen, but simply through longevity and experience, I gained a certain amount of credibility with these sources. And so when I come knocking on their door and say, look, I'm writing a book about the supernatural, I want to talk to you about miracles, that door might be closed to a lot of people, but because I've known them for 30 years, they say, well, all right. They think I'm a reasonable person, so they say, come on in, I'll talk. And in fact, in writing about the supernatural, I was pretty amazed. I got one refusal of the probably 50 or 60 interview requests I made at the Vatican. And that guy was a retired archbishop. He had worked at the doctrinal congregation, and he knew secrets that he basically didn't want to tell me. So about certain visionaries who had been disciplined. And he didn't want to get into particulars, so he simply declined. But for the most part, I was shocked, really, at how open people were, talking about the devil, angels, exorcism, miracles, everything under the sun.
So it's an awful question for this late in an interview, but how close is the Dan Brown world to this? I mean, one has the feeling that some of these folks have access to, if there are other dimensions besides the banal, there's some people there with access and deep experience. Did you find that?
Well, I read Dan Brown's books, and what struck me about Dan Brown was that he keeps readers going, and he has a good narrative arc, and he has a compelling plot, and he has characters who know how to be conspirators. That's really what's lacking at the Vatican, is that kind of conspiratorial coordination. There are small-scale scandals going on and percolating up all over the place at the Vatican. It's a human place. We have gossip, we have mismanagement of funds, we have little lies being told, we have jobs being given to somebody's nephew, you know, who wasn't qualified, all kinds of things like that. But in terms of, you know, a vast plot to control the Catholic Church or to hide a secret that's been kept under wraps for thousands of years, no, I don't think the Vatican could do that. And the reason is, as I say, they don't have the conspiratorial skills to do that. As I say, generally, Dan Brown has great imagination. What happens at the Vatican are much less dramatic things that are interesting in their own right, and I find them telling. But usually when you dig and you're looking for a big plot, it's funny how empty-handed you come up with. I mean, this happened when the Pope's butler was arrested. I mentioned the Pope's butler. He was the guy who folded the clothes, who was supposed to be the kind of servant to the Pope, and who was feeding this Italian journalist confidential documents. Now, immediately everyone assumed that he was the pawn in somebody's bigger game, that there must have been a cabal of cardinals working against Pope Benedict in a very coordinated fashion to wrest power from him and make their own decisions, or to prepare for his successor. Well, obviously, that isn't true. His successor has cleaned house and you know, is anything but a conspiracy character. And they had a trial of the butler, and they didn't find any evidence to show that he was being controlled by anyone. You know, in the end, I think it's likely that he was a very misguided, perhaps unbalanced person who thought he was doing the right thing, but wasn't. The same thing happened when Pope John Paul I died after 33 days in office. The very first thing I heard walking into my coffee bar that morning was, "L'hanno ammazzato." They killed him. And that was the Roman reaction. They murdered him. And I thought, oh boy, what a place. I guess they go around murdering popes still. Well, I later dug into this as a journalist, and I discovered that Pope John Paul I had been very sick. He had phlebitis. He had terrible circulation problems. The day he died, he had been awaiting medication and a visit from his doctor in Venice, where he had lived. The pills never arrived. He died of a heart attack and was found by the nun who brought him coffee in the morning. Of course, the Vatican made a mistake by omitting the part about a nun finding him and saying it was a priest. And they also embellished a bit, saying the Pope had been reading The Imitation of Christ, when in fact he was looking at some papers about Vatican finances. But in the end, I think the truth was, he was a very sick man. The scandal was that he had been elected Pope. That the Italians had rammed this choice down the throats of all the cardinals, basically because two other stronger Italian candidates were checkmated. They were at loggerheads in the voting. So they compromised on Papa Luciani from Venice, John Paul I, who both sides thought they could control. They knew he was a sick man, but the other cardinals did not. And believe me, when the cardinals came back to Rome the second time in 1978 for the second conclave in a month, they were not happy campers. They went to the Italians, they said, "Why didn't we know this man was sick? This has made the church a laughingstock." And the cardinals went on to elect the first non-Italian pope in 4.5 centuries. I think this was a big factor in why we had a Polish pope.
And he swims.
Yes, and he swims. He was only 58 years old. A young pope, too. They weren't going to take any chances on some guy falling dead after another month.
Well, thanks for your time. I look forward to however many more books you can produce on this, and perhaps we can visit again sometime.
I would love it. Thank you.